It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and I remember because the leaves on the maples along our street had just turned that deep red I always loved. I'd driven to the Ray Doe Center to pick up a birthday card for my sister. Nothing special, just one of those quick errands you do without thinking. I was cutting through the food court on my way back to the parking garage when I saw her. My daughter. She was sitting alone at one of those small plastic tables near the Tim Hortons, hunched over, her coat too thin for the weather we'd already been having. She had her purse open on the table and she was pulling out coins, lining them up one by one, counting them quietly to herself. A medium double-double sat in front of her, half empty and probably cold. She hadn't seen me yet. I stopped walking. Something about the way she was sitting, shoulders curved inward, head down, made my chest feel tight before I even understood why. My daughter is 41 years old. She works full-time at a dental office in Barhaven. She should not be counting coins at a food court on a Tuesday afternoon. I walked over and said her name. She looked up and, for just a second, just 1 second, I saw something on her face before she arranged it back into a smile. It was shame, plain and simple. "Mom," she said. "Hi, what are you doing here?" I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Never mind me. What are you doing here? Weren't you supposed to be at work this morning?" "I had a half day," she said. She started putting the coins back into her purse. I watched her hands. "Where's your car, sweetheart?" She paused just slightly. "Marcus has it. Why does Marcus have your car?" She said his truck was in the shop, getting the brakes done. She said it like she'd rehearsed it quickly, moving on. Asked me how my knee was doing after the physio appointment. I answered, but I kept watching her face. My daughter has her father's eyes, dark brown, very still, and she's never been a good liar. Not since she was 8 years old and blamed the broken lamp on the cat. "How long has his truck been in the shop?" I asked. She picked up her coffee. "A few weeks." "A few weeks," I repeated. "Mum, it's fine. He just prefers my car. It's newer. His is older, the heat doesn't work well, and it's getting cold. So he's driving your car to work every day, and you're taking the bus." She didn't say anything. I looked at her coat again. Last winter, she'd had a beautiful wool coat, caramel-colored, that her husband had given her for Christmas the year before that. This was a thin, quilted thing, the kind you buy at Costco for $49. The zipper pull was broken off, and she was holding it closed with a safety pin. "Is that the coat you had last year?" I asked. "This one's warmer, actually," she said. "It's got good insulation." She would not look me in the eye when she said it. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a social worker with the city of Ottawa before I retired, and I sat across from enough people in enough difficult situations to know when someone is not telling me the truth, and more importantly, when they're terrified. I know what fear that's been lived with for a long time looks like. It lives in the body differently than ordinary stress. It makes people smaller somehow, like they're trying to take up less space in the world. My daughter was trying to take up less space. I reached across the table and put my hand on hers, and I said, "Sweetheart, talk to me." She shook her head. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. She looked out toward the food court, the families with strollers, the teenagers with their paper bags, and she blinked several times, and then she started to cry. Very quietly. She pressed her lips together and tried to stop it but couldn't, and she turned back to me and said, "I don't know where to start." "Anywhere," I said. "Start anywhere." What she told me over the next hour and a half changed everything I thought I knew about the last 2 years of her life. She and Marcus had been married for 4 years. I knew Marcus. I'd had him at my dinner table probably 60 times. He was quiet, not unfriendly, worked as a project coordinator for a construction company in Nepean. I'd had some small reservations early on. He had a way of speaking over my daughter in conversations, finishing her sentences in a direction she hadn't intended. But I'd told myself that was just his manner. Lots of people are like that. I'd been glad she wasn't alone. What I didn't know, because she'd hidden it from me carefully and I hadn't looked hard enough, was that things had shifted significantly about 18 months after the wedding. "It started with the finances," she said. "Marcus had suggested they combine their accounts. He framed it as building toward their future, buying a house, being a team. She'd agreed. She transferred her savings, just over $22,000, money she'd built up slowly over her 30s, into their joint account. Within 6 months, the account had been drained into what Marcus called investments. He never showed her the statements. When she asked, he said she wouldn't understand the financial instruments involved and he'd walk her through it when the time was right. The time was never right. Her paychecks from the dental office were deposited into that same joint account. Marcus managed the account. When she needed money for groceries, she had to ask him. When she needed money for her own prescriptions, she has a thyroid condition, she's been on medication for years, she had to ask him. He gave her what he decided was appropriate, and if she questioned it, the conversation always ended the same way. She was ungrateful. She didn't understand how hard he was working. She was making him feel like he wasn't trusted in his own marriage. I sat very still while she told me this. She told me about the car. It wasn't that his truck was in the shop. His truck hadn't worked properly in over a year, but he'd refused to deal with it, said repairs were too expensive, said they'd figure it out. Her car was a 2021 Honda CR-V that she'd bought with her own money before they were married. When she'd tried to take it to work one morning last spring, Marcus had said she should take the bus. He was using it for a site visit. She'd taken the bus. The next day, the same thing. She'd started budgeting for the OC Transpo monthly pass out of the grocery money he gave her. She told me she'd stopped going to her book club because she couldn't afford the gas for a cab home after, and Marcus said it was irresponsible to spend money on taxis. She told me she'd stopped getting her hair cut at the salon she'd gone to for years, and was doing it herself in the bathroom with scissors from the dollar store. She told me she'd been bringing her lunch from home every day, not because she wanted to, but because Marcus reviewed their spending and restaurants were not in the budget. And there was his mother. His mother lived in Canada, 20 minutes from their apartment in Gloucester. She was a retired school administrator, sharp, well-dressed, and she absolutely adored her son with the kind of adoration that has no room for anyone else. In the beginning, she'd been polite enough to my daughter, but as Marcus tightened his grip, his mother became the supporting structure that made it possible. She told my daughter she was lucky to have a husband who handled the money, that managing finances was stressful, and my daughter should be grateful. She told her that the problems in their marriage were because my daughter didn't make Marcus feel appreciated enough. She came to their apartment twice a week, and she and Marcus had long conversations in the kitchen while my daughter sat in the other room. Once, my daughter told me, she'd overheard them discussing whether her name should be removed from the lease. She'd been afraid to tell me any of this. She said she was ashamed. She knew how it would sound. A grown woman, educated, professionally employed, letting this happen. But she said it didn't feel like letting anything happen. It felt like standing in water that gets deeper very slowly, and by the time you realize you can't touch the bottom anymore, you're too tired to swim. She also said she was afraid that if things escalated, Marcus would make it difficult for her to see Bo. Bo is her dog, a 6-year-old golden retriever she'd had since before Marcus came into the picture. She loves that dog the way some people love their children. Marcus had started referring to Bo as a liability, said he was thinking of rehoming him, said the dog cost too much in vet bills and food. He'd used Bo as a lever more than once. She'd been staying quiet to protect the dog. When she finished talking, I poured what was left of her cold coffee into mine without asking, and I held both her hands across the table and I said, "This stops now." She shook her head. "Mum, it's not that simple. We have a joint lease, everything's tangled up. I don't have money to get a lawyer." "You don't need money," I said. "I have money. That's what it's for." "He'll make things difficult." He can make things as difficult as he wants," I said. "It won't matter." I meant it, and I was already thinking. I didn't tell my daughter everything I was going to do. I told her I was going to look into some things, and that I needed her to do one thing: stop letting Marcus know we'd had this conversation. She looked worried when I said that. She asked what I was planning. I told her I was going to talk to some people and get a clearer picture of where things stood legally and financially before we did anything that would make Marcus stick his heels in further. I told her trust me. She said okay. That night I called my friend Patricia, who'd retired the year before I did and had a daughter-in-law who was a family lawyer in Sentrytown. I explained the situation broadly. Patricia gave me her daughter-in-law's direct number and told me to call in the morning. I called in the morning. The lawyer's name was Denise, and she was calm and methodical in the way that good lawyers tend to be. She confirmed what I'd suspected. What my daughter was describing had elements of financial abuse and coercive control, both of which are recognized under Canadian law and can be relevant in separation proceedings. She also told me that because my daughter's savings had been deposited into a joint account and then disappeared, there was potentially a claim for unjust enrichment, depending on documentation. Documentation. I spent the next 2 weeks collecting it quietly. I asked my daughter to take photographs of her bank statements going back to when she'd opened the joint account. She still had access to the online portal. Marcus hadn't thought to lock her out. She sent them to me in batches, and I printed them and put them in a folder in my filing cabinet at home. We found that the $22,000 she'd transferred in had been followed shortly after by a transfer of $19,000 to an account that was not the joint account, an account that appeared to be in Marcus's name only. The investments had been a transfer to himself. I asked my daughter to write down every incident she could remember, dates, what was said, what's taken or withheld. She sent me pages over several evenings, typed on her phone during her lunch break at work. She told me writing it down made her feel sick, but she did it. I drove past their apartment building in Gloucester one Thursday evening on the pretext of being in the area. Marcus's truck was in the parking lot. My daughter's CRV was there too. He hadn't been driving it to work that day. It had been sitting there while she took 2 buses each way. I photographed the parking lot. I don't know exactly why, but I did. I also contacted the Provincial Tenant Rights Helpline to understand what my daughter's rights were under the Ontario Residential Tenancies Act regarding the lease. Because they lived in Ontario, the apartment was in Gloucester, technically Ontario, despite being right on the Ottawa border, she had protections. Removing her from the lease without her consent wasn't something Marcus could simply do. Knowing that helped me understand what leverage he actually had versus what he was telling her he had. He'd been inflating his power significantly. 3 weeks after that afternoon at the Rado Center, Denise had reviewed all the documentation and told us we were in a strong position to proceed. She recommended that my daughter request a voluntary separation and the return of her savings and property before moving to any formal claim, because it was faster and would cost less. She prepared a letter outlining the evidence, the legal exposure Marcus faced if he didn't cooperate, and the specific terms required: return of the CRV, a full accounting of the transferred funds, a release from the joint lease, and surrender of any claim on Beau. Marcus received the letter on a Wednesday. He called my daughter that evening, very controlled, very cold, said he assumed her mother was behind this and that it was going to make things worse for everyone. My daughter had put the call on speaker, and I was sitting right there at her kitchen table. She'd been staying with me for 5 days by then. Marcus didn't know. He thought she was at a friend's place. She didn't say I was there. She told him she needed the things in the letter. He said he'd call his own lawyer. He did call a lawyer. And his lawyer, apparently, was competent enough to explain to him what the documentation meant. 10 days after that, Marcus signed everything Denise had prepared. He returned the CRV. He signed a repayment agreement for $15,000 toward the transferred funds, not all of it. Denise had advised us that recovering all of it would require a full court process, which would take much longer and cost more. But $15,000, paid in structured installments, documented and enforceable. He was released from the lease separately, and my daughter was given a new lease in her name alone. The landlord was cooperative. Apparently Marcus had been late on rent twice without telling her, which the landlord was quietly relieved to have resolved. And Marcus's mother called me once during all of this. She said I had interfered in a private marriage and that my daughter had never given their relationship a proper chance. I told her that her son had taken $22,000 from my daughter, controlled every grocery purchase for 2 years, and had taken her car. I told her that if she'd like to discuss what a proper chance looks like, I was happy to continue the conversation. She hung up. I won't pretend the ending was everything I would have wanted. There was no day in court. There was no moment where Marcus sat in front of a judge and had to account for what he'd done. The system doesn't always give you that. But my daughter was out. Her dog was safe. She had her car. She had money coming back to her. She had a lease in her own name for an apartment she could actually afford on her own income. On the first Saturday after she got the keys to her apartment, I helped her move in. We borrowed a pickup truck from my neighbor's son and made 3 trips. She didn't have much. Marcus had kept most of the furniture they bought together, which Denise had advised her to let go given the overall picture. But she had her things, her clothes, her books, Beau's bed and his bowls and his leash. She had the coffee maker she'd had in her 20s that she'd kept in the back of a closet. She had a small framed photo of her late father that she'd been keeping at my house for the past year because Marcus had said it didn't go with the decor. She put that photo on her windowsill first before anything else. That evening, we sat on the floor of her mostly empty living room because there was nothing to sit on yet, and we ate Swiss chalet takeout from the containers, and Beau kept trying to fit himself onto my lap despite being 68 pounds, and my daughter laughed, really laughed. The kind of laugh she used to have when she was a teenager, loud and unself-conscious. And I thought, there she is. There's my kid. She looked at me at one point, a quarter chicken in one hand, and she said, "I should have told you sooner." "Yes," I said. "You should have." "I was ashamed," she said. "I know, but shame is what he was counting on." I pointed a fork at her. "He needed you to be too embarrassed to ask for help. That was the whole architecture. The moment you told me, the architecture started coming down." She was quiet for a minute. Then she said, "I didn't think I deserved to be helped." That one sat with me for a long time. I've been a social worker. I know, intellectually, that this is what sustained abuse does to a person. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up in a recognizable shape. It whispers to you daily that this is normal, that you're the problem, that no one would understand, that you should be grateful for what you have. And eventually you believe it. But knowing that intellectually and hearing your own daughter say she didn't think she deserved help, those are two entirely different experiences. "You have always deserved help," I told her. "From the day you were born. That is never going to change." She nodded. She didn't cry. She'd done most of her crying in the weeks before, quietly, in the evenings at my house. Now she seemed like someone who had finished a very long and difficult task and was allowing herself to just sit. We finished the takeout. Beau fell asleep across both our laps. The apartment was cold because the heat hadn't fully kicked in yet, and there were no curtains on the windows, and the streetlights came in orange and steady. It was, honestly, one of the best evenings I've had in years. She's been in her apartment for 4 months now. She got a small sectional from Facebook Marketplace, a kitchen table from Value Village, curtains she sewed herself from fabric she found on sale at Fabricville. She's painting the bedroom this weekend, a soft green. She sent me a picture of the paint chip. She's back at her book club. She's getting her hair cut properly again. Beau got a checkup at the vet last month, perfectly healthy. The first repayment installment from Marcus came through on the agreed date. So did the second. I think about that Tuesday at the food court sometimes. The coins lined up on the table. The thin coat. The way she tried to put the smile back on her face before I got close enough to see underneath it. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I'd been in a hurry that afternoon. If I'd been looking at my phone, or taken a different route to the parking garage, if I hadn't stopped. But I did stop. That's the thing about paying attention to the people you love. Sometimes it's the only thing that matters. The phone can wait. The errand can wait. When your daughter is sitting alone in a food court counting coins, you sit down. You sit down and you don't leave until she talks to you, and then you don't stop until it's fixed. I've thought a lot about what made this whole situation possible. Not just Marcus's behavior, but the conditions that allowed it to go on for as long as it did. The truth is, it wasn't one dramatic moment. It was dozens of small ones. A question not asked. A detail not pushed on. A reassurance accepted too easily. My daughter hid things from me because she was ashamed, and she was ashamed because Marcus had spent months teaching her to see herself as the problem. That's how it works. It's not a sudden collapse. It's a slow reframing of reality, done so gradually that the person inside it can't see the edges anymore. I don't say that to excuse myself. I missed things I should have caught. I noticed the distance, and I told myself it was just life. She was busy. She was building something with her husband. I didn't want to intrude. That's a thing we do as parents of adult children. We pull back to give them room. But there's a difference between giving someone room and giving someone so much room that they disappear into it. What I know now is that paying attention is not intrusion. Asking a second question when the first answer doesn't quite fit is not intrusion. Sitting down when you see your daughter counting coins at a food court, that is not intrusion. That is love doing its actual job. My daughter made a choice when she finally spoke. She'd been making the opposite choice for a long time, to stay quiet, to manage the situation herself, to protect everyone else from the weight of it. But protection that comes at the cost of your own life isn't really protection. It's just a slower kind of disappearing. The moment she chose differently, everything that had felt fixed and permanent started to move. That's the thing about asking for help. It feels like weakness from the inside. It feels like admitting failure. But from where I was sitting, across that plastic table with her cold coffee between us, it looked like the most courageous thing she'd done in years. Marcus made choices too. He chose to take what wasn't his, to use fear and shame as tools, to treat his marriage as something to be managed rather than someone to be respected. And those choices had consequences, not because the universe balances accounts on a schedule, but because actions leave evidence, and evidence, when gathered carefully and presented clearly, has weight. He sat across from a lawyer's letter, and he understood, finally, that the architecture he built depended entirely on my daughter not knowing her own options. Once she knew them, the whole thing came apart in 10 days. That's what I want people to take from this. Not that everything works out. Sometimes it doesn't, and the system is slow and imperfect and frustrating. But that clarity is power. Knowing what you're actually dealing with, knowing what the law actually says, knowing what you're actually entitled to, that changes the calculation entirely. Marcus had counted on confusion, on isolation, on my daughter believing she had no leverage and no one in her corner. She had both. She just needed someone to sit down and stay. I'm 63 years old, and I spent my career watching people navigate the worst moments of their lives. The ones who came out the other side weren't always the ones with the most resources or the most luck. They were the ones who, at some point, stopped trying to manage the situation alone and let someone stand next to them. That's not weakness. That is, in fact, the whole point of having people who love you. My daughter is painting her bedroom green this weekend. Bo is healthy. The money is coming back. And every time I drive past the Retro Center now, I think, good thing I wasn't looking at my phone.